For that. Hannah and Christine, thank you for having me here. I'm indeed at Van Alen Institute, and at Van Alen Institute we've been doing three things for 120 years. We make design competitions, often with governments. We do research and we develop public programs. And even though I'm not going to talk much about the design competitions, there's a whole other strand of what is fitting for today. A few words on it. We work often with big government entities, most recently for the Obama administration, trying to resolve what is happening with big superstorms like Sandy hitting the Northeast. But sometimes also much smaller projects, such you see here at the top right, those red steps, many of you will know if you've been to New York and to Times Square. Those came out of a Van Alen competition a long time ago. Today I actually want to talk more about our research, and our research is often focused on cities. And when people talk about cities, it's often dangerous because you occasionally, or very often actually, get only the bird's eye perspective. And I think that's not necessarily what we should be looking at all the time. I'm much more comfortable on the ground, looking at the people in the city and how they operate and how they run a city. And over the past years, both at the Guggenheim, where I was 5 years before joining Van Alen Institute, as well as at Van Alen, I've been looking at how cities really change us. How do we behave differently in different types of cities? Since we had such a nice theme for today, I thought I would try and stick to it a little bit. So time machines, and usually with time machines you are looking forward, trying to project into the future. Especially in architecture and urban planning, that's always a risk, an interesting risk. But I would like to take a step back, and it's actually nice that several of the other speakers have also done that today. And I wonder if we really understand our history as well as we should. I know I really don't always, so I've been exploring it more and more. And perhaps a nice example of understanding history a little bit better and the value of understanding the history is this little anecdote out of Brooklyn. Some of you will recognize this museum. The Brooklyn Museum, a fantastic museum, big museum, interesting shows. This is in the early 20th century. Big grand staircase going up to the McKim-Mead and White building. And this is what you saw for many museums around the US. Then this is a few decades later. Fascinating, no? So taking the grand steps away because they wanted people to walk straight into the building. An interesting idea, so no longer up those the big steps. But then see what happens, and this is much more recently. Steps are back. So I think there is a value in sometimes understanding what you have and perhaps not taking everything away. They could have left the steps and just create a passageway into the building without taking the steps away. And this is leading me to another frustration that I have, which is often a disconnect between users of spaces and designers of spaces. And a very simple introduction that we all know as an example are the towers in the green. Of course, we got so excited about this when we first started thinking about them, the potential of living in the green. But then perhaps didn't realize what was going to come. It wasn't always the great way of living. It was actually quite a tough way of living. And a nice example from Germany, this was a new town, Langwasser, built right after the Second World War. The idea there was that kids could happily play in the green and there was so much space and it was going to be perfect. Wasn't perfect at all. And actually what it turned out to be, and this came out of an article in the early 70s in the New York Times, that kids actually preferred a much more messy environment, a little bit of chaos. They would prefer to go actually to building sites and hang out there, and not all of these rigid, overly planned spaces. Well, we all know what happened after that. So building complexes like Pruitt-Igoe were taken down. In France, you probably know the examples of Frédéric Drouot and Locaton and Vasal, who are reskinning these buildings. The reskinning is perhaps not that important, but what is very interesting is that they're also plugging in new programs on the ground level. So, understanding of history and trying to create a better way of thinking between designers and users. And then that article in the New York Times of the 70s. That article was no surprise at all, actually. because it fits perfectly with a period that started in the 70s that was called behaviorism. And I would like to revisit that. I have been revisiting it in my projects, in art projects, but I would also like to revisit it here today. Behaviorism was not a new term in the 70s. It actually came out of the early 20th century and came out of psychology, of course. And people were interested, or beginning to be interested, in trying to figure out how do we get impacted by the environments that we live in? What is our response to them? And in the 70s, people realized that we actually, even though the term had been coined decades and decades before, in the 70s we still didn't know how we were getting impacted. And what happened is that suddenly a lot of design schools, especially in the US, jumped over at putting the individual at the center of the design process and trying to see, like, okay, what are the psychological factors? What are the environmental factors? And what can we learn from this? Well, and this to me was fascinating because I won't read them all out. But then suddenly all of these design schools, which of course had very serious programs, had programs like the Man-Environment Relations program, or the user requirements, behavioral determinants of design, and so on and so on. But the strange thing was, this only lasted for 10 years and basically disappeared right after that. And perhaps not so surprising, and this was a quote already from the mid-70s, worrying what would be happening very soon, is that of course architects saw all of this happening, and it was happening in the design schools, but then actually didn't really stick to it. And I think the reason for all of that was that things couldn't be properly measured. There was a good intuition that we were getting impacted by the environment, but that intuition, it was not justified at that moment yet. And the exciting thing is that we're at a very different time right now. We can measure things. And many of these intuitions that were starting to surface then, disappeared for 30 years, are coming back quite quickly and are seeing a new life. What I want to do is look at 4 items, 2 of them very briefly, and 2 a little bit longer, from this particular time, the behaviorism time in the 70s, being personal spaces, participatory planning, post-occupancy evaluation, which sounds very serious, but is perhaps not so much, and the stimulation of behavior. Those first 2 were often topics in projects that are developed for the Guggenheim, but also at Van Alen. For instance, personal spaces, we looked at in Mumbai with the BMW Guggenheim Lab, where we were trying to get an understanding, what is the relationship between privacy issues and density? I'm not going into it, but it's quite amazing that in a city with such high density as Mumbai, there's not even words for privacy in most of the local languages. The participatory planning aspect, that we have been working on quite seriously on the Van Alen side. Participatory planning often meant that you were going to sit around the table leading up to a big public space project or a new building project, sit around the table with a community with sticky notes and a map, which is not a process that I really believe in. So what we have been trying with Van Alen is how can you draw communities in a different way. So for instance, here we're running a parade, a marching band parade, which looks utterly silly, but it was actually a very good way to draw a community into the process with the designers without over-promising anything and with a much better understanding between designers and communities later on. Another possibly interesting way into participatory planning that we have been looking at is through the show that I curated with a bunch of friends for the US Pavilion for the Venice Biennial a few years ago. The show was fully focused on how non-designers are actually taking over some of the urban thinking in the US with very small public space interventions. Good, so those are the 2 first elements of that list of the 70s, and those are all coming back in new iterations. The 2 last points on that list, post-occupancy and then the behavioral stimuli, those are actually the more interesting aspects because that's where it's becoming about measuring things. So measuring what's happening in a building or in a space after it has been designed and is getting used, was something that started with these beautiful diagrams in the 70s. Not only diagrams, by the way, but also in projects like this. So this is the William White analysis of the plaza in front of the Seagram building. Very nicely shot on video, and you've probably all seen this in the past if you're into public space issues. And what they were doing then, they were literally standing around the plaza and calculating. It's like, okay, who's coming through the space? How much time do they spend on this corner, on that corner? Zooming in on this with cameras. But they couldn't do much more at this point. One project that we ran with Van Alen was called How Does the Brain Respond to the City? And in this case, we could actually measure this type of thing much more actively by looking what is happening in people's brains. Together with Columbia's Cloud Lab, we outfitted people with these small brain sensors. And we sent them around to neighborhoods, all at the same itinerary, trying to see how people's minds were responding to that particular neighborhood. Actually, it's interesting also to see how people respond to you walking around with a thing like that on your face. I did it on a Sunday morning, and I got called a Google nerd several times, and that was on a Sunday. But so we had these people go around, and actually what we were doing is mapping their brainwave activity against the GIS data of this particular neighborhood. This is Dumbo, right in Brooklyn. And what you see here is quite interesting. So, and we know some of these things intuitively or anecdotally, but there's not always data for it. And what you see happening here is where the brain is spiking. So the red are spikes of activity in your brain, and the green is where the brain is basically tuning out and having a little bit more of a quiet time. And that's, I always find interesting, because what you see here is that we actually get most active on the street corners, or right under that big passageway, which is actually the Manhattan Bridge. And that's, of course, because either you need to be very careful, you're going to cross the street, or there's so much noise that your mind really has trouble sometimes making up what is going on. So this type of research I find very interesting, and I'm happy that we can do it these days and feel that we can push the thinking of the behaviorism of the 70s further. Another aspect of the 70s was the stimulating of behavior, and at that point it was actually very often about uniform behavior, which I find actually rather scary. Because you don't all want to do the same things these days. And perhaps some of you know some of these names that I'm going to run through rather quickly. Walter Mischel was a psychologist, and he was writing about public spaces. And in his mind, public spaces were not necessarily what we think public spaces are doing. In his mind, public spaces were leading people to perceive them in the same way. Fascinating, scary perhaps. And induce uniform expectancies of how you behave in those spaces and what is the appropriate behavior. As soon as the word appropriate is being used, I always get a little nervous. And then also, what kind of skills do people need to be in those spaces? And this was not strange, and he was not the only one. So, for instance, also in the US, there was this man Skinner, very popular writer at that point. Of this book, he sold 75,000 copies, which is a very big number, especially at this point in time in the 70s. And they were looking at, what is beyond freedom? And he really believed that there was no freedom anymore. Everything had to be organized, and he could organize that through spatial design also. Scary stuff. Actually, Richard Sennett, so this is Skinner again, but Richard Sennett, a sociologist, still practicing today, although getting a little bit older, was very critical already at that point of it, because he said, people do not all behave the same way in public spaces. We're luckily all different types of people. And with that thinking in mind, that also started in the 70s, but people didn't want to really listen to that, we have been looking at a project that makes people a little uncomfortable sometimes. This is a project that we're currently running in London, together with Imperial College and their Sustainable Society Network. The project is called Ecologies of Addiction. So instead of some of the more romantic or sweet projects that we sometimes try to dive into as architects and designers, we were looking for a slightly more taboo topic that people do not like speaking about very much. But we were wondering, is there actually a relationship between the public spaces, between the spaces of the city, the form of the city, and the addictions that take place in those cities? I believe there is, and actually for a very simple reason. I'm not sure how many of you have lived in different cities over the course of your lives, but I moved from Rotterdam, I'm Dutch as you can tell from the accent, to the US almost 10 years ago. And I think I'm a very different person in each of these two places. And it made me wonder, like, okay, would these places also possibly lead to different types of addictions? Of course, with a project like this, we're not only looking for a very simple statement, but in the end also want to be involved with design and policy innovation at the end of the project. A little bit more on how the project is being run. So as I said, Imperial College, their Sustainable Society Network. Together we issued a call for UK-based researchers, and we found this group, led by a neuroscientist all the way on the right, and then he's working with 2 landscape architects and an artist. So a very interesting group. And they also realized things had to be measured in this case, perhaps slightly differently than they were usually doing in his particular field of neuroscience. And together they've been developing an app, and you would think like, oh gosh, another app, which is what I said first. But actually it's quite a helpful tool to generate the data for this particular research. What this app is doing, it's measuring, or it's giving you questions, such as these, over the course of the day. You get 5 to 7 pings a day for a week on end, and we're trying to get 1,000 respondents into this survey. They're quite far along already. And your answers are being tracked against where you are in the city. And that's actually quite interesting that you can do that these days, of course. And then what we're trying to figure out in London, because there's many types of addictions that you could be looking into. It could basically range from drug and alcohol addiction to speculation or sex addiction for that matter. But in London, 2 of the topics that are the most promising or prevalent are internet addiction and alcohol addiction. And what they're working through is, okay, what is happening on the ground? What is happening with these 1,000 respondents? How can we track their data of the particular places in the city to their way of behaving impulsively? And apparently, and I didn't know this, but the more impulsive you are, the more prone you are to develop an addiction. We're apparently all addictive in some shape or manner, but yeah, if you are more impulsive, it manifests itself more easily. And then what I also didn't know is that impulsivity is very heavily regulated or pushed by the environments that we occupy. So very interesting to slowly start seeing more information come into this process. And hopefully what we're doing over the coming months after wrapping up in London at the end of the year is taking it back to the US, doing more case studies on the ground, and trying to really start shaping some of the design policies in some of the cities in the south of the US. So quite interesting what is going on with it. So I was able to stay under 20 minutes, Christine. What I think is important is to sometimes look back and get out of the jargon that is very popular in architecture and design discourse. Understand a little bit more of what the history is that we're coming from, but also see if we can reshape those histories quite actively by the tools that we have these days. So using these new technologies, using them effectively, but also very critically, and then see if we can get a new wave of behaviorism going that over time hopefully starts to reshape the thinking around design, and eventually also the thinking about what we're doing in cities.